A dying 8-year-old boy in a wheelchair handed his most precious possession, a worn red toy truck, to a leather-clad stranger outside a children's hospital, whispering that real men help each other out. 3 days later, the thunderous roar of 300 Harley-Davidsons shook the entire town as the largest motorcycle escort in state history formed outside his house. But what could possibly drive hardened bikers from across the country to drop everything and ride hundreds of miles for one little boy they'd never met? The morning air hung thick with hospital disinfectant and the weight of unspoken goodbyes as 8-year-old Tommy sat in his wheelchair outside the children's wing, breathing tubes snaking from his nose like a transparent lifeline. The plastic wheels of his chair caught in the grooves of worn concrete while he waited for his mother to finish another consultation with doctors who spoke in hushed tones and avoided direct eye contact. His fingers clutched a battered red toy truck, its paint worn smooth from countless adventures across imaginary highways. The metal cab dented from drops and crashes that had once seemed catastrophic, but now felt like precious memories of a time when broken toys were his biggest worry. The rumble of motorcycle engines cut through the sterile quiet, growing louder until leather boots appeared in his peripheral vision, and Tommy looked up to see a mountain of a man with graying beard and club patches kneeling down to his eye level with surprising gentleness. "That's a fine truck you got there, little man," the biker said, his voice carrying the gravel of countless miles and cigarettes, yet softened by something that reminded Tommy of his father's bedtime stories. The man's hands were scarred and weathered, adorned with rings that caught the afternoon sunlight. But his eyes held the same careful attention that nurses used when checking Tommy's AV lines. Tommy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his failing lungs, and everything to do with the loneliness that lived there. The ache of watching other children run while he counted breaths like precious coins. "My dad always said, 'Real men help each other out,'" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of medical equipment. "And you look like you could use a good truck more than me." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, carrying with them all the weight of wisdom that comes too early to children who understand mortality before they understand multiplication tables. Marcus, though Tommy didn't know his name yet, felt something crack open in his chest as those small trembling hands extended the truck toward him. The gesture so pure and unexpected that it cut through years of accumulated cynicism like sunlight through storm clouds. The toy felt impossibly light in his callous palms, yet somehow contained the weight of every childhood he'd forgotten to cherish, every moment of innocence he'd taken for granted during his own healthy youth. "Are you sure about this, buddy?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer, in the determined set of Tommy's thin shoulders, in the way the boy's eyes never wavered, despite the effort each breath required. Tommy nodded with the solemnity of someone making a decision that mattered more than anything else in his shrinking world. And Marcus carefully tucked the truck into his leather jacket, feeling it settle against his ribs like a promise he didn't yet understand how to keep. From the hospital window 3 floors above, Tommy's mother, Sarah, watched this strange exchange unfold, her hand pressed against glass that felt cold as her son's future, tears streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed what might be her boy's final act of pure generosity. The doctors had given him weeks, maybe days, their clinical assessments delivered with the practiced detachment of professionals who learned to protect their hearts from breaking too often. She'd seen Tommy give away his favorite books to other patients, watched him share his few remaining good days with children, even sicker than himself. But this felt different, more final, more like a goodbye, disguised as kindness. The biker rose slowly, Tommy's gift secured close to his heart, and something in his lined features promised adventures that her son's body could no longer take. Journeys that would live in the spirit of a red toy truck, traveling roads Tommy would never see. The rumble of Marcus's Harley faded into the distance, leaving only the antiseptic silence of the hospital and a mother's racing heart. Marcus rode away from the hospital with the small truck burning against his chest like a brand, its presence a constant reminder of the courage he'd just witnessed and his own failures as a man who'd spent years complaining about traffic jams and overpriced beer, while a dying child worried about strangers needing help. The weight of Tommy's gift pressed deeper than metal and plastic had any right to carrying with it the memory of his own son, Danny, lost to leukemia, 3 years prior in a different hospital, but with the same antiseptic smell and the same helpless vigil of parents watching their children slip away, breath by breath. That night, in his cluttered garage, surrounded by chrome and engine parts that had once seemed important, Marcus pulled out the red truck and set it on his workbench under the harsh fluorescent light, studying its burnished edges and faded paint job, as if it might reveal the secret of how an 8-year-old could possess more grace than most adults would ever know. The story poured out of him at the clubhouse that Friday, his voice rougher than usual, as he described Tommy's thin frame and the steady gaze. The way such delicate hands could hold such enormous generosity. Kid's got maybe 2 weeks left, Marcus told the assembled brotherhood. Men whose own scars ran deep and whose understanding of loss had been carved by motorcycle accidents, combat tours, and the particular grief that comes from watching strong people break. Gave me this truck like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he was worried I didn't have one. The room fell silent, except for the clink of beer bottles and the distant hum of the highway that called to them all. Each man processing the story through his own lens of regret and missed opportunities to matter in someone else's life. Word spread through the motorcycle community like wildfire catching dry timber. Marcus's account traveling from the local chapter to regional leaders, then across state lines through phone calls and encrypted messages until writers from Texas to Maine were learning about Tommy's gift and the kind of selfless courage that most adults only witnessed in movies. The story resonated in ways that surprised even Marcus, touching something primal in men who'd built their identities around strength and loyalty, but who recognized in Tommy's gesture the purest expression of both virtues they'd ever encountered. Chapter presidents found themselves taking calls from members wanting to know more, writers asking for the kid's address, tough guys with tears in their voices wondering what they could possibly do for a boy who'd already given more than he'd received. Sarah answered her phone on Sunday evening to hear a gruff voice introducing himself as Marcus, explaining that he'd met Tommy at the hospital and that some friends wanted to show their appreciation for her son's kindness. "We'd like to escort Tommy to school tomorrow, ma'am," he said, the formality in his tone, barely concealing an emotion that ran much deeper than casual charity. "Show him what real brotherhood looks like." Sarah's knees buckled as the implications hit her. Her son, who'd never experienced anything close to celebrity or recognition, would be honored by the very people society taught children to fear. The irony wasn't lost on her that Tommy, who'd spent his short life being seen as fragile and different, had somehow earned the respect of men whose entire existence revolved around being seen as dangerous and untouchable. That night, as Sarah helped Tommy with his breathing treatments and medications, she struggled to find words that could prepare him for what tomorrow might bring, without building expectations that could be disappointed. "The man you gave your truck to called?" she said carefully, watching Tommy's face for any sign of fatigue that might indicate he wasn't strong enough for excitement. "He wants to visit your school tomorrow, along with some friends." His face lit up with the first spark of genuine joy she'd seen in weeks, and he whispered, "Do you think he's taking good care of my truck?" Sarah nodded through her tears, knowing that her son's concern for his gift's welfare revealed the depths of a heart too big for his failing body, too generous for a world that rarely returned such kindness. Sarah spent that night checking on Tommy every hour, her mind spinning between terror and hope, as she imagined what dawn might bring. The first rumble began before dawn, a distant thunder that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than the sky, growing steadily stronger until Sarah realized it wasn't a storm approaching, but something far more extraordinary. She pulled back Tommy's bedroom curtains to reveal a sight that defied every expectation she'd harbored about the previous night's phone call. Motorcycles stretching down their quiet suburban street like a river of chrome and leather, their riders dismounting with the precision of a military operation. The sound was overwhelming, a symphony of Harley-Davidson engines that made the windows rattle and car alarms shriek in protest, yet somehow felt less like chaos and more like the gathering of an army assembled for the most important mission of their lives. Tommy pressed his face against the glass with wonder that temporarily eclipsed his labored breathing, his medical equipment forgotten as he counted motorcycles that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Marcus appeared at their front door, flanked by chapter presidents whose patches told stories of brotherhood forged across state lines and decades of loyalty. Men whose battle-scarred faces had seen too much, but whose presence here spoke to something pure that transcended their rough exteriors. "We've got about 300 riders here, ma'am," Marcus said to Sarah, his voice carrying a reverence, usually reserved for churches or graveyards. "They came from as far as California and Florida, left their jobs and families because your boy's story traveled faster than any of us expected." The toy truck sat prominently on his bike's handlebars, polished to a shine that made it gleam like a talisman, and Tommy's eyes fixed on it with the recognition of something precious being honored rather than merely carried. The school principal had arrived early after receiving frantic calls from parents and police dispatchers, expecting trouble, but finding instead the most organized and respectful gathering he'd witnessed in 20 years of education. News crews scrambled to position themselves along the route, their reporters struggling to explain why hundreds of intimidating bikers had converged on an elementary school for one terminally ill child, their cameras capturing scenes that would challenge every stereotype their viewers held about motorcycle clubs and the men who rode in them. The police chief, initially concerned about crowd control and public safety, found himself directing traffic for what had become the largest peaceful demonstration in the county's history. Officers taking pictures of the procession they knew their own children would want to hear about for years to come. Tommy's classmates pressed their faces against every available window. As the procession formed with military precision, their teacher abandoning lesson plans to witness history unfolding in their schoolyard. Marcus lifted Tommy carefully onto his bike, Tommy's slight frame dwarfed by the massive Harley, but somehow belonging there, as if this moment had been written in some cosmic plan that none of them fully understood. The breathing apparatus was secured with the same attention to detail that these men applied to their most precious cargo, and his tiny hands gripped Marcus's leather jacket with the trust of a child who'd learned to recognize genuine kindness beneath unexpected packaging. As they began to move through town at a ceremonial pace, Tommy waved from behind Marcus like royalty returning from conquest, his smile visible even through the clear plastic of his oxygen mask. The procession rolled past the hospital where he'd spent countless months, past the park where he'd once played before illness claimed his strength, past every landmark of his brief but significant life, while the entire community emerged from homes and businesses to witness something they'd never seen before and would never forget. Store owners stepped onto sidewalks, construction workers climbed down from scaffolding, and office workers abandoned their desks to catch a glimpse of the most unlikely parade in their town's history, many of them wiping away tears as they realized they were watching love manifest in its purest, most unexpected form. The thunder of 300 motorcycles gradually gave way to an almost sacred silence as they pulled into the school's parking lot, engines cutting out one by one until the only sounds were Tommy's steady breathing and the whispered conversations of children who'd never seen their playground become hallowed ground. Marcus helped Tommy down from the bike with the gentleness of a father handling his most precious treasure, his legs unsteady but his spirits soaring higher than his struggling respiratory system had allowed in months. The assembled bikers formed a corridor of steel and hide that led directly to the school's main entrance, their massive forms creating a protective honor guard for the smallest hero any of them had ever encountered. Men whose own battles with demons and disappointments suddenly seemed trivial compared to Tommy's daily courage. "I can feel my dad smiling," Tommy whispered to Marcus as they walked slowly toward the building, his words carrying across the hushed gathering like a benediction that blessed every mile these riders had traveled to be here. Sarah walked behind them, her hand covering her heart as she watched her son experience something that transcended every limitation his disease had placed on his young life. Surrounded by protectors who'd emerged from the most unexpected corners of humanity's spectrum, the toy truck, now secured to Marcus's vest like a medal of honor, caught the morning sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across the asphalt as if Tommy's generosity had somehow learned to bend light itself into symbols of hope. Tommy's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, met them at the classroom door, with tears streaming down her cheeks, having spent the morning explaining to 257-year-olds why their classmate deserved an escort that most world leaders would envy. The children erupted in cheers that mixed with the gentle rumble of motorcycles being started again. The riders preparing to disperse back to their regular lives, but carrying with them the memory of mourning that had reminded them why brotherhood and honor weren't just words embroidered on patches, but principles worth writing hundreds of miles to uphold. Tommy took his seat at the small desk he'd occupied for barely 2 months of this school year, his breathing equipment positioned with the same care the bikers had shown throughout the morning, and began to tell his classmates about the adventure that had carried him to school on the wings of thunder. Marcus lingered in the doorway longer than protocol typically allowed, watching Tommy's animated description of the morning's events. Tommy's enthusiasm making his words tumble over each other despite his labored breathing. The red truck remained prominently displayed on Marcus's vest, and he knew that every mile he rode from this day forward would carry Tommy's spirit along roads. The child would never physically travel, but would forever inhabit in the memory of a gift freely given to a stranger who'd needed it, more than either of them initially understood. The other riders had begun their journeys home, their motorcycles carrying them back toward regular responsibilities, but with hearts fundamentally changed by witnessing grace disguised as an 8-year-old's simple generosity as the last engine sounds faded into the distance, and Tommy's school day began in earnest. Sarah stood in the parking lot holding the business card Marcus had pressed into her palm, his phone number written in careful block letters beneath a simple message for anything you need anytime. She understood that her son's gift of a toy truck had created something larger than charity or kindness. It had forged connections that would outlast Tommy's remaining time and honor his memory in ways that would echo through the motorcycle community for decades to come. The morning sun climbed higher over the elementary school, where her boy was learning his final lessons about friendship and courage, surrounded by classmates who would someday tell their own children about the day 300 angels arrived on motorcycles to escort the bravest person they'd ever known safely home to where he belonged. Carrying his light forward on highways that stretched toward infinity,